A brilliant millionaire CEO never believed in miracles, until one night changed everything, waking up in a hospital to discover the three boys who saved him were his own sons he never knew existed. Pause. Welcome to Black Struggles, where we uncover stories of heartbreak, hope, and redemption. Alexander Reed left his office late that night, the city already wrapped in a heavy, restless darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. His assistant had urged him to take a car, but Alexander refused. The walk helped him clear his mind, helped him focus, and he needed clarity now more than ever. He had just closed one of the most complicated deals of his career, and though outwardly composed, inside he felt the exhaustion gnawing at his bones. His steps were brisk, purposeful, and he barely noticed the empty streetlights flickering overhead. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another email, another meeting scheduled for the morning, but he ignored it for once. He just wanted to get home, have a drink, and sink into the blessed silence of his apartment. He didn't hear the footsteps at first. His mind was too full, and the city was never truly quiet, but a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye made him slow down. A man detached himself from the shadows near the alleyway, moving quickly and deliberately. Alexander's instincts flared, too late. The first blow hit the side of his head with brutal force, sending him sprawling onto the cold concrete. His vision blurred instantly, the world tilting sideways as another blow landed, pain exploding behind his eyes. He tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't respond the way it should have. Pause. Who were the mysterious voices that saved him from this brutal attack? Stay tuned with Black Struggles to find out. As he struggled, barely able to lift his head, he heard a voice, small, urgent, panicked. Then another, and another. They were young voices, shouting something he couldn't quite catch. His mind, sluggish and clouded with pain, registered the sound of footsteps running away, sirens wailing in the distance, and then hands, small, frantic hands, tugging at his sleeve, checking if he was awake. He caught a glimpse of a face, then two more, all blurred by the pounding in his skull. Children, he thought dimly. What were they doing here? Pause. Could these children hold the key to a secret Alexander never imagined? Hit that subscribe button for Black Struggles to uncover the shocking truth. The last thing Alexander saw before everything faded into darkness was a pair of bright blue eyes staring at him, wide with fear, but filled with something else, too, determination, maybe even recognition. The darkness pulled him under, but the image stayed, burned into his mind, stubborn and persistent, refusing to let go. The steady beep of a heart monitor was the first thing Alexander heard when he woke. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nose, and the bright fluorescent lights above made him squint painfully. For a moment, he had no idea where he was or why his body ached with every breath he took. Then the memories slammed back into him, the street, the attack, the voices. He turned his head slowly, wincing as pain shot through his skull. A nurse noticed he was awake and hurried over, speaking in a calm voice he barely registered. He wasn't listening to her words. His attention was fixed on the doorway where three small figures stood, almost frozen, as if unsure whether they were allowed to come closer. The boys looked identical, about 6 years old, all three with light brown hair that curled slightly at the ends, pale skin smudged with dirt, and the same piercing blue eyes that stared at him with a mixture of fear, worry, and something deeper. They wore mismatched clothes, t-shirts a size too big, sneakers scuffed and worn. One of them, the one standing a little ahead of the others, clutched a small, crumpled baseball cap in his hands, twisting it anxiously. Alexander frowned, trying to understand. They didn't look like hospital staff's children.
They didn't belong to any visitor he could imagine.
And yet, there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. He tried to sit up, but pain lanced through his ribs, and the nurse gently pushed him back down, murmuring something about a concussion and a few cracked ribs. He forced himself to stay still, but kept his gaze locked on the boys.
Finally, the one in front took a hesitant step forward.
His voice was small, but clear.
"Are you okay?" he asked. Alexander swallowed, his throat dry.
"I think so," he rasped, feeling ridiculous talking to a child in a hospital bed.
Another boy, standing slightly to the left, spoke up next.
"We called the police," he said.
"When the bad man hurt you."
The third nodded vigorously, his hands balled into fists at his sides.
"We stayed until they came." Alexander blinked, trying to process their words.
They had seen the attack. They had helped him. They had saved him. His mind, still sluggish from injury, couldn't grasp why three young boys would be following him late at night, why they would risk their safety for a stranger. He opened his mouth to ask, but before he could form a question, the first boy, the one with the cap, said something that made the entire world tilt again.
"We knew it was you," he said simply. "We've been watching, because you're our dad." For a long moment, Alexander thought he must have misheard.
His mind scrambled for some rational explanation, some alternative meaning. But when he looked into their faces, into those eyes, the same shade of blue as his own, he knew there was no mistake. He stared at them, too stunned to speak, as the world inside his chest cracked open, letting in a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared for. The nurse said something about needing to call someone, a social worker, maybe, but her voice was distant, drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. He lay there, staring at these three small, trembling boys, feeling his carefully constructed life beginning to collapse under the weight of a truth he had never imagined existed. Alexander remained silent long after the nurse had stepped out to give him space. His mind raced, trying to piece together something that made sense, but every logical thread fell apart the moment he looked at the boys standing awkwardly by the door. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, exchanging uncertain glances, but none of them moved closer without an invitation.
Finally, Alexander forced himself to speak, his voice rough.
He asked their names, not because he doubted them, but because he needed something real to hold on to. The boy with the cap said his name first, standing a little taller as if trying to show he was brave. "I'm Jake," he said, his voice steady but soft. The second boy, the one who had spoken earlier, said, "I'm Noah." He had a quieter energy about him, thoughtful and hesitant.
The third boy, slightly smaller, though it was barely noticeable, stepped forward and added, "I'm Ethan."
His voice trembled just a little, but he lifted his chin like he was daring Alexander to argue. Jake, Noah, and Ethan, names that sounded simple, but suddenly carried the weight of an entire world he had never known existed.
Alexander swallowed hard, his throat dry.
He asked them gently how they knew him, how they had found him, and Jake, the apparent leader of the trio, explained in broken sentences that their mother had told them a little bit about him, not much, just that he was someone important, someone she didn't want to burden with their existence. She hadn't said much, but there had been a box of old photographs hidden in the back of a closet, photographs of Alexander smiling stiffly at business events, articles clipped from newspapers, awards with his name printed in bold black letters. Ethan chimed in, explaining how they had pieced together who he was, how they would sometimes sit outside the tall glass building where his office was and watch for glimpses of him. They had seen him walk to lunch, seen him get into his sleek black car, seen him talking into his phone with a frown. To them, he had been a distant figure, someone impossibly important, larger than life. And yet, something had drawn them to him anyway, something more than just curiosity or wonder. They had watched because, deep down, they felt that he was part of them. Alexander listened, his chest tightening with every word. He tried to imagine their little bodies crouched behind benches, peering around corners just to catch a glimpse of a man who didn't even know they existed. It made him sick to think of it, the years lost, the moments missed, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the first words, and first steps, all the things he had been too blind, too busy, too detached to even realize he should have been looking for. Noah pulled something out of his jacket pocket, then a small, crumpled photograph. He crossed the room and placed it carefully on Alexander's blanket, looking up at him with eyes so painfully familiar, it made Alexander's breath catch. The photo was old, faded. It showed a younger Alexander standing next to Emily Carter, his arm loosely around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something off camera. It was from another lifetime, a time before the weight of ambition had hardened him. The boys stared at him, waiting not for anger, not for explanations. They were waiting for acknowledgement, for acceptance, maybe even for love, though they didn't say it out loud. Alexander stared at the photograph, then back at the boys, and something deep inside him, something that had been locked away for years, cracked open. He didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't even know what the right questions were. But he knew one thing with terrifying certainty: these boys were his. They had found him, even when he hadn't been looking. They had saved him, first from a man in the street, and now from the loneliness he hadn't even realized was devouring him from the inside. And he would not walk away from them, not now, not ever. The next morning, Alexander was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to rest, which he immediately ignored. His body ached with every step, but he needed answers more urgently than he needed comfort. He arranged for a driver, and after ensuring the boys were safely staying at a nearby social services center temporarily, he set out to find Emily Carter. He hadn't spoken to her in years. After their sudden breakup, she had disappeared so completely from his life that it almost felt like she had never existed at all, save for the occasional memory he allowed himself late at night when loneliness crept in. But now, everything was different. He had 3 sons he had never known, sons who had risked themselves to save him without hesitation. He couldn't ignore that, no matter how complicated it made his world. It didn't take long to track her down. Money bought speed, and within hours he had an address, a modest townhouse in a quiet, worn neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. He stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, staring up at the narrow building, wondering what he was supposed to say to the woman who had hidden his children from him. Finally, he forced himself to move. When he knocked, there was a long pause before the door creaked open. Emily stood there, framed by the doorway, looking almost exactly as he remembered and yet utterly changed. Her hair was pulled back in a messy braid, a few strands of gray threading through the once rich chestnut. She was thinner, paler, with faint lines around her mouth and eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and years of silent battles. But her posture was still proud, her chin still lifted, as if daring him to judge her before he even spoke. For a moment, neither of them said anything, they just stared at each other, time folding in on itself, the past crashing into the present. Finally, Emily's voice broke the silence, tired but steady. "I guess you found out." Alexander nodded once, unable to trust himself to speak without anger, confusion, or worse, betrayal leaking into his words. He stepped inside without asking, and she let him, closing the door quietly behind him. They sat in the small living room, surrounded by furniture that had clearly seen better days but was kept meticulously clean. He noticed small things: the worn books on the shelf, the boys' drawings taped to the refrigerator, a broken toy soldier resting on the coffee table. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice low. "Dangerous." "I know," she said, looking down at her hands. "I was scared. I didn't know what you would do." "What I would do," he repeated, disbelieving. "They're my sons, Emily." "I was young," she said, voice trembling now. "And you were building your empire. You had no room for a complication like me, let alone 3 more. I thought it would destroy everything you worked for. And then, when I realized I was pregnant, it was too late. You were already gone, and I was too proud to chase you." Alexander's chest tightened painfully. The anger he had been ready to unleash faltered, replaced by something heavier and more devastating: grief for all the time lost. "You didn't even give me the chance to decide," he said, softer now. "I know," she whispered. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I've lived with that every day." For a long time, they sat there, 2 broken people, trying to find a bridge between them. Emily wiped her eyes and looked at him directly, her voice stronger. "They're good boys. They're kind. They're brave. And they deserve better than a man who only wants them out of guilt." "I don't want them out of guilt," Alexander said. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clenched together. "I want them because they're mine, because they saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." Emily's face crumpled then, and she covered her mouth with her hand, the first real crack in her armor. Alexander reached for her instinctively, but stopped himself. They weren't ready for that yet, maybe they never would be, but they could start with honesty, with something real. "I want to be in their lives," he said firmly. "Not because it's easy, not because it fixes the past, but because it's the only thing that feels right." Emily nodded slowly, as if weighing the truth in his voice. "Then don't disappear when it gets hard," she said quietly. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I won't," Alexander said, and he meant it with a certainty that shocked even him. He wasn't walking away, not from her, not from Jake, Noah, and Ethan. Whatever came next, he would face it, no longer alone. The first time Alexander saw the boys outside the hospital setting, it was both more overwhelming and more natural than he expected. Emily arranged for them to meet in a small park near her home, a place with aging swings and worn picnic benches shaded by large oaks. It wasn't some grand, orchestrated introduction, but something simple, almost cautious, like testing if a bridge could hold weight before stepping onto it fully. Alexander arrived early, sitting on a bench that creaked under him, his heart pounding in a way no hostile corporate negotiation had ever managed. When he saw them coming down the path, Jake leading the way with confident strides, Noah lingering behind, and Ethan gripping a worn, stuffed animal in his hands, his throat tightened painfully. They stopped a few feet away, uncertainty radiating off their small bodies. Alexander stood and gave a small, unsure wave, feeling ridiculous for how unsteady he felt. Jake stepped forward first, tossing a quick glance over his shoulder at his brothers before squaring his shoulders. "You look better," he said, nodding seriously. Alexander smiled at that, a real smile, and crouched down to their level, ignoring the pull of pain in his ribs. "Thanks to you 3, he said. "You were really brave." Noah shuffled closer, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his hoodie, looking shy but curious. Ethan hung back, clutching his stuffed animal like a lifeline, his wide eyes fixed on Alexander as if trying to decide if he was real or just another story told to fill empty spaces.
Alexander didn't rush them.
He let the silence stretch, learning already that patience would be the language they trusted most.
After a long moment, Noah asked quietly, "Are you really our dad?" Alexander's voice almost broke when he answered, "Yes, I didn't know, but now I do, and I want to be."
Jake exchanged a look with his brothers, something wordless passing between them. And then, in an almost startling burst of motion, all three boys moved toward him at once. It wasn't a hug exactly, it was more like they surrounded him, a messy, awkward, perfect tangle of limbs and small bodies pressing close, as if anchoring themselves to him before he could disappear again. Alexander wrapped his arms around them carefully, feeling the slight tremble in their frames, the rawness of their hope and fear and need. His vision blurred, but he blinked hard against the sting. They spent the afternoon together, sitting on the grass, kicking a soccer ball around, laughing more than he had in years. Alexander learned that Jake liked dinosaurs and always wanted to be the leader, that Noah loved puzzles and animals, and that Ethan, despite being the quietest, was the most fiercely protective of his brothers. Every tiny detail, every slip of a smile, every fleeting glance they gave him, felt like a treasure he had almost lost forever. Emily watched from a distance, sitting on another bench, her posture tense at first, but slowly relaxing as the minutes stretched into hours. She didn't interfere, didn't hover, she gave them the space they all needed, trusting them to find their own way toward each other. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of gold and pink, Alexander sat with the boys at a picnic table, sharing sandwiches that Emily had packed. Jake, with the bluntness only a child could muster, asked if Alexander was going to stay forever.
Alexander didn't hesitate. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. "No matter what." It wasn't a perfect afternoon, there were awkward pauses and small moments of sadness when the reality of everything they had missed hovered too close. But there was laughter, too, and the kind of quiet peace that comes only when something broken begins to mend. That night, driving home alone, Alexander couldn't stop replaying every detail in his mind, the sound of their voices, the weight of their small bodies against his, the way Ethan had slipped his tiny hand into his without a word. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be anger, confusion, moments of fear, but there would also be love, real and fierce and undeniable. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed wasn't afraid of building something he couldn't control. He was ready to fight for it, to stay for it, to become someone worthy of the miracle he had been given. The days that followed were some of the most challenging and transformative of Alexander's life. Integrating himself into the boys' world was not something that could happen overnight, no matter how much he wanted it to. Jake, with his boldness, tested Alexander, constantly pushing limits, demanding attention in ways that sometimes left Alexander feeling unprepared and raw. Noah was quieter but wary, often watching from the sidelines, as if waiting to see if Alexander would lose patience and walk away like some half-remembered nightmare. Ethan clung closest, not speaking much, but always staying within arm's reach, needing silent reassurances that Alexander wasn't just another temporary visitor in their chaotic young lives. Alexander had to learn everything from scratch. He learned that Jake hated broccoli with a passion and would try to hide it under napkins when no one was looking. He learned that Noah liked to read aloud, but only if he could sit curled up in the corner of the couch, hidden behind pillows. He learned that Ethan had nightmares sometimes, and that the only thing that calmed him was a soft, steady voice telling him he was safe. Alexander stumbled and made mistakes. He bought the wrong brand of cereal,
struggled to figure out how to braid a shoelace properly when Noah's came undone, lost his patience once when Jake dared him to a race and then accused him of letting him win. He felt completely, utterly out of his depth. But he also learned that the boys forgave quickly, that a real apology mattered more to them than grand gestures. He learned that they were desperately eager to trust, but scared to do it too fast. He learned that showing up every day, even in the small ways, mattered more than any promises spoken out loud. Emily watched all of it happen with a kind of cautious hope. She saw the way Alexander fought for their trust, not through gifts or bribes, but by being present, by listening, by admitting when he didn't know something, instead of pretending to have all the answers. He took them to school when he could, attended their tiny soccer games, sat in folding chairs surrounded by other parents who had no idea who he was outside of being Jake, Noah, and Ethan's dad. One afternoon after school, as they walked home crunching through piles of golden autumn leaves, Jake suddenly turned and asked, "Are you going to live with us now?" The question was so casual, so simply stated, that for a moment Alexander couldn't find his voice. He crouched down so he was eye level with them and said, "If you'll have me." Noah looked up at him, his blue eyes serious and older than they should have been for a boy of 6, and he said, "We already did." That night, Alexander sat with Emily in her small living room after the boys had fallen asleep, exhausted from chasing each other around the yard. They sat without speaking at first, sipping tea and listening to the creaks of the old house settling around them. Finally, Emily asked, "Are you sure you want all of this? It's not going to be easy." Alexander set down his mug and looked her directly in the eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. And he meant it. Every late night, every moment of doubt, every ache in his ribs from laughing too hard at something silly the boys said, it all mattered. It all built something stronger than anything he had built with contracts or stock prices. They weren't a picture-perfect family, they had scars, old wounds, fears that would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of his title, not because of his wealth, but because 3 small boys had decided he was worth saving, because Emily, despite everything, was willing to let him try. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present. And Alexander, a man who had once thought love was a weakness, now knew that being loved and loving in return was the greatest strength he had ever discovered. Thanksgiving came faster than Alexander expected, bringing with it a mixture of excitement and anxiety he hadn't felt since his earliest childhood memories. Emily suggested hosting a small dinner at her house, keeping things simple for the boys, who had never experienced a real holiday celebration with a full family. Alexander immediately offered to help, even though he had no idea what helping truly meant when it came to preparing a holiday meal. He was used to catered boardroom lunches and high-end restaurant reservations, not peeling potatoes at a kitchen table while 3 energetic 6-year-olds ran circles around him, but he loved every chaotic second of it. The boys were giddy with excitement from the moment they woke up, buzzing around the house with a kind of innocent joy that was contagious. Jake insisted on helping with the stuffing, although more of it ended up on the counter than in the dish. Noah took charge of decorating, crafting small paper turkeys and scattering them across the dining room like confetti. Ethan, always the observer, quietly stayed close to Alexander's side, handing him ingredients and giving solemn nods of approval as they worked. Alexander's hands were clumsy with tasks he had never learned, but his heart was steady, anchored by the laughter that filled the walls around him. Later, when the food was finally in the oven and the boys were sprawled on the floor playing with toy cars, Alexander and Emily sat on the back porch, sharing a blanket between them to ward off the chill. She looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the late afternoon.
"You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "if someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here today, I wouldn't have believed it." Alexander smiled, not the tight, professional smile he wore for the world, but a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Neither would I." They talked about the boys, about school and dreams, and little worries that seemed so small compared to the world he used to inhabit. Emily admitted how scared she had been that he would resent them, that he would see them as a burden rather than a gift. Alexander reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers carefully. "They're the best thing that's ever happened to me," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt clouding his words. She squeezed his hand once, hard, and they sat there a little longer, not needing anything else. When dinner was served, it was imperfect and messy and absolutely perfect. The turkey was slightly overcooked, the mashed potatoes were lumpy, and Jake spilled cranberry sauce all over the tablecloth, but it didn't matter. They laughed, they told stories, and when it came time to say what they were thankful for, the boys each had something to say. Jake said he was thankful for soccer and dinosaurs and his new dad, who came to his games even when it was cold. Noah said he was thankful for books and for people who didn't leave. Ethan, his voice barely a whisper, said he was thankful for family and looked directly at Alexander when he said it. Alexander felt something crack wide open inside him again, something that didn't hurt, but healed. He cleared his throat, blinking fast against the sudden burning in his eyes. And when it was his turn to speak, he said simply, "I'm thankful for second chances." Emily smiled at him across the table, a small, tearful smile that held so much more than words could ever say. That night, after the boys had collapsed into their beds, exhausted and happy, Alexander helped Emily wash dishes in the quiet kitchen. She bumped her shoulder into his and laughed when he nearly dropped a plate. It was such a small, ordinary moment, but it was everything he had never realized he needed. Later, when he tucked the boys in, he knelt beside each bed, smoothing blankets, brushing hair back from sleepy foreheads. Jake mumbled something about dreaming of dinosaurs, Noah clutched a book to his chest, even in sleep, and Ethan, before drifting off, whispered, "I'm glad you didn't leave." Alexander sat there for a long time after they fell asleep, watching them breathe, listening to the small, steady rhythm of their lives. He thought about the man he had been before, restless, unsatisfied, constantly chasing something he couldn't even name. Now, sitting in a small house filled with warmth and clutter and unconditional love, he finally understood. He hadn't needed more success or more wealth, he had needed this, he had needed them. And somehow, against all odds, they had needed him, too. Winter settled over the city, softening its edges under a blanket of frost and early darkness. Alexander found himself cherishing the quiet routines he was building with the boys and Emily, the once chaotic moments now woven into a tapestry that felt rich and irreplaceable. Every morning, he woke up earlier than necessary just to make breakfast for them, even if it was nothing more than scrambled eggs and toast slightly burned at the edges. Every evening, he read them stories before bed, sometimes falling asleep in the middle of a chapter with Ethan curled up against his side and Jake tucked under his arm. Life was no longer a race, it was something measured in tiny, irreplaceable moments that slipped into his soul and anchored him in a way he had never thought possible. One Saturday in early December, Alexander suggested something he had never imagined himself doing before, getting a real Christmas tree together. Emily agreed, though her smile was tinged with amusement at his awkward excitement. They piled into his car, the boys chattering nonstop in the back seat about which tree would be the biggest and how many ornaments it would need. At the tree lot, they ran from row to row,
examining each pine and fir with the seriousness of seasoned judges. Jake argued for the tallest tree they could find, while Noah insisted on one with the most perfect branches. And Ethan, quieter but decisive, chose a smaller, slightly lopsided tree that leaned gently to one side. Alexander laughed and agreed without hesitation, and together they loaded the imperfect tree into the car, the boys clambering over one another to help secure it. That evening, their living room became a chaotic storm of lights, glittering ornaments, and handmade decorations. Alexander let the boys hang the ornaments wherever they wanted, even when three were crammed onto the same branch. He watched them with a fullness in his chest that no achievement had ever given him. Emily made cocoa and chipped mugs, and Alexander helped untangle a stubborn knot of lights, pretending to be frustrated while secretly enjoying every second. After the tree was finally finished, they turned off all the lights except for the ones wrapped around the branches. The small living room glowed with a golden warmth, and Alexander sat on the couch with the boys piled against him, their faces lit by the soft, flickering colors. Jake yawned first, then Noah, and finally Ethan, their bodies heavy with sleep as the long day caught up with them. Alexander carried each boy to bed carefully, marveling at how natural it had become to know the way their heads would tuck against his shoulder, the way their breaths would even out once they felt safe. Later that night, as snow began to fall outside the window, Emily and Alexander sat together in the living room, the tree lights still blinking softly. She looked at him over the rim of her mug and said, "You know, they think the world of you." Alexander shook his head lightly, humbled in a way he could never have predicted. "They saved me," he said. "I'm just trying to catch up." Emily smiled, a real smile filled with forgiveness, hope, and a little sadness for the time they had lost. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You're here now," she whispered. "That's what matters." In the following weeks, Alexander filed the necessary papers to legally adopt Jake, Noah, and Ethan. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a promise carved into every fiber of who he was becoming. At the final hearing, when the judge asked if he understood the responsibility he was taking on, Alexander answered without hesitation, his voice steady and clear. "They are my sons, they always have been. I'm just lucky enough to know it now." As they left the courthouse, the boys bounced around him, clutching his hands, laughing and shouting that they were officially official now. Emily stood a little apart, watching with tears in her eyes, her heart visibly stitched back together by the love she had once feared might never find them. That night, back home, Alexander tucked them into bed, kissed their foreheads, and whispered that he loved them, words he once thought he would never be able to say with such ease. When he finally sat down beside Emily, the house quiet around them, he felt something settle deep in his chest, not the restless ambition that had once driven him, not the hollow victories he had chased for so long, but something heavier, richer, and infinitely more real. He was no longer the man who rushed through life looking for meaning in numbers and power. He was the man who had found it in three small boys with wide blue eyes, a woman who had forgiven his absence, and a home filled with laughter and hope. He didn't need a perfect life, he didn't need control, he needed exactly what he had: messy, unpredictable, beautiful love. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed understood what it meant to be truly, irreversibly whole. Pause. Thank you for joining us on Black Struggles for this incredible story of love, family, and second chances. If this moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters.